My constituents look around their town and they've seen their once booming home change beyond recognition.
But if the police decide to issue me with a fixed penalty notice, I would, of course, do the right thing and step down.
The leader of the Reform Party in the United Kingdom and our dear friend, maybe the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, if he keeps the roll up, the head of the Reform Party, none other than the wonderful Nigel Farage. Nice to see you. Things keep rolling your way.
We'll finally take back control of our borders and close the book on a squalid chapter for our politics, our economy and our country.
A political earthquake has erupted at the very heart of Britain following a dramatic and clandestine meeting within the walls of Buckingham Palace. In an extraordinary turn of events, King Charles delivered a damning rebuke to Sir Keir Starmer's covert efforts to realign Britain with the European Union. Yet what stunned the nation even more than the King's intervention was the presence, utterly unexpected and shrouded in secrecy, of Nigel Farage. Once dismissed and politically sidelined, Farage has now re-emerged at the centre of power. Starmer, it seems, had gravely miscalculated. The man he believed silenced has returned, and with him, the full truth of Labour's hidden ambitions is beginning to unravel. Starmer's covert strategy to usher Britain quietly back under the influence of Brussels has been brutally exposed. Farage, emboldened by momentum and unflinching resolve, stood alongside the King, demanding transparency and accountability. This moment may well redefine the course of the nation. Brexit betrayed. Democracy under threat. The British public on the verge of righteous indignation. For months, whispers haunted the corridors of Westminster. Sir Keir Starmer, the same man who once swore to honour the will of the people, had, according to insiders, been engaged in secretive talks to dismantle Brexit. Far from public scrutiny, Starmer and his closest circle reportedly held undisclosed discussions with EU officials, crafting a blueprint for Britain's quiet return to European oversight. There was no public mandate. No democratic debate. Just quiet arrangements, hidden agreements, and veiled commitments, all pointing to a calculated reversal of Britain's hard-won sovereignty. His alleged objectives were audacious and deeply controversial: to tether the United Kingdom once more to EU trade regulations, reintroduce the free movement of EU nationals, and surrender border controls back to Brussels. And all of it, it seems, was to be executed without the knowledge of Parliament, and worse still, without informing the monarch. But Starmer's clandestine machinations began to unravel. Subtle clues emerged in obscure corners of the press: a hushed conversation, a leaked memo, a whisper of disloyalty. The scent of betrayal permeated Westminster, and eventually, the murmurings reached the gates of Buckingham Palace. King Charles, renowned for his calm and deliberate nature, was watching closely, and he was not pleased. In his role as the constitutional guardian of the nation's sovereignty, the monarch could not stand idly by. Acting discreetly, the King summoned his most trusted advisers. Starmer's covert dealings with the EU could not be allowed to proceed unchecked. A critical intervention was needed, someone outside the establishment with the courage to speak the truth, however uncomfortable. And so, a discreet summons was sent to Nigel Farage. Once mocked and marginalized by the political elite and mainstream media alike, Farage now found himself called upon in Britain's hour of need. The man who had delivered Brexit was back, summoned to the palace to confront the unfolding betrayal. Farage arrived under cover of darkness. No fanfare, no flashing cameras, only the soft echo of footsteps through the hallowed halls of the monarchy. Inside the King's private chambers, he laid bare the full extent of what had transpired: Starmer's covert EU negotiations, the secret treaties, and the silent subversion of democratic will. King Charles listened intently. And then, he delivered 5 words that would send shockwaves through Westminster: "This must be stopped now." The monarch's resolve was unmistakable. Starmer's EU scheme would never see the light of day. The freedoms fought for by millions of Britons would not be bartered away behind closed doors. Yet this dramatic meeting was just the beginning. The political storm was only beginning to gather strength. In a momentous and unprecedented twist in British politics, Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has been forced to resign following a cascade of ethical controversies, explosive revelations, and mounting public fury. The Supreme Court's involvement underscored the magnitude of the allegations, and its ruling, which condemned Starmer's conduct as a breach of the ethical standards expected of a public servant, became the final nail in a crumbling political edifice. At the centre of the storm lay questions over lavish gifts and financial favours accepted by Starmer, most notably from Labour donor and media magnate Lord Wahid Ali. According to public records, the Prime Minister had received more than £107,000 in personal benefits, including designer clothing for his wife, Victoria Starmer, premium concert tickets, and the use of a luxury London apartment. Although these were eventually declared, the initial failure to disclose them in a timely manner prompted intense media scrutiny and a wave of public condemnation. Matters worsened when it emerged that Starmer had filmed a public service announcement during the COVID-19 lockdown from Lord Ali's £20,000 a month flat, all while urging the British public to remain at home. Critics accused him of hypocrisy and double standards, arguing that he had enjoyed private luxury while asking the public to endure hardship. As public pressure intensified, Starmer's record as Director of Public Prosecutions also came under renewed examination, further eroding trust in his leadership. The Supreme Court's decision, though stopping short of criminal allegations, declared that Starmer's actions had severely undermined public confidence in democratic institutions, leaving resignation as the only viable option. The televised announcement of the verdict gripped the nation and triggered immediate political upheaval. The Labour Party, already under strain, descended into chaos. Starmer's resignation created a leadership vacuum, exposing deep ideological divisions between factions. Senior MPs scrambled to protect their positions, some distancing themselves from the disgraced leader, others stepping down altogether. Grassroots members demanded sweeping reforms, including tighter oversight on party finances, improved ethical standards, and more transparent governance. Yet this was only the beginning. As the nation reeled from Starmer's resignation, a deeper betrayal began to surface, one that sent shockwaves across the political landscape. Revelations emerged suggesting that Starmer had been engaged in clandestine negotiations with Brussels, aiming to forge a new economic alignment with the European Union. This covert initiative, orchestrated without public consent, threatened to reverse the result of the 2016 referendum. At the heart of the backlash stood Nigel Farage. Once derided and dismissed by the political establishment, the former Brexit Party leader had returned to the national stage with extraordinary force. Energized by rumours of a secret EU pact, Farage became the focal point of a resurgent populist movement. His rallies drew massive crowds, his warnings about Starmer's alleged duplicity set social media ablaze. Why has he hidden these negotiations? Farage demanded. Why did he deny the people a referendum? Why attempt to erase Brexit behind closed doors? These questions, echoed by journalists and shouted by protesters, dominated headlines. The press descended on Downing Street, bombarding Starmer with accusations. Did the King block your EU summit? They asked. Are you betraying Brexit? Starmer, once assured and authoritative, now appeared visibly shaken. He snapped at reporters, refused to answer, and increasingly withdrew from public view. Even loyal Labour MPs began to express private doubts, warning that his alleged EU plot could spell the collapse of the government itself. And then came the royal bombshell. In an extraordinary development, King Charles, usually silent and above the political fray, was said to have issued a discreet but firm warning to senior ministers: any move to rejoin EU frameworks without the people's consent would not go unchallenged. While not a public pronouncement, the King's intervention sent a clear and chilling message: this stops now. Across Britain, public sentiment exploded. From quiet villages to industrial cities, the mood turned febrile. In pubs, factories, and high streets, ordinary voters murmured the same refrain: he's trying to betray Brexit. The political storm intensified, and at its eye stood three men: a prime minister cornered by scandal, a monarch breaking centuries of silence, and a rebel leader, resurgent and emboldened. Soon, secret documents began to leak. Buried deep in Whitehall files were draft agreements, confidential EU correspondence, and internal government memos. These documents painted a damning picture. Starmer's government had been preparing a new alignment treaty with Brussels that would tether Britain to EU laws on trade, migration, and finance, all without a public vote. The details were staggering. Under the plan, Britain would relinquish control of its borders, courts, and sovereign legislation in exchange for economic incentives from the European bloc. Worse still, Starmer had assured EU leaders that no referendum would be held. The will of the people, hard-won in 2016, was to be overridden by stealth. When whistleblowers from within the civil service confirmed the authenticity of the leaks, public fury reached boiling point. Tabloid and broadsheet alike blared headlines: Starmer's secret surrender, Number 10 plot exposed, Brexit betrayed. Radio programs lit up with angry callers, television studios buzzed with punditry and outrage. On social media, millions voiced their sense of betrayal. Then came the tapes. Leaked recordings surfaced of senior Labour officials discussing how to manage public outrage when the deal became known. In cold, dismissive tones, voices could be heard mocking voters. "They'll calm down when the economy improves," one sneered. "We don't need another referendum. We'll handle this in-house." These tapes confirmed the worst fears of Brexit supporters. The betrayal had not been accidental, it had been premeditated. Protests erupted across Britain. Banners reading, "No EU surrender, Starmer out," and "Save Brexit," filled city streets. Labour's betrayal had become a national emergency. Farage capitalised on the crisis. Delivering fiery speeches in Parliament and across the media, he demanded Starmer's resignation and the cancellation of any EU realignment. "This man promised Brussels your sovereignty without asking your permission," he thundered. "This is the greatest political scandal of our time, and it must not stand." Polls showed a dramatic collapse in support for Labour while Farage's popularity soared. Even lifelong Labour supporters turned their backs on the party, disgusted by the perceived betrayal. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, the King's private warning loomed large. For constitutional scholars, the notion of royal intervention against a sitting Prime Minister was nothing short of seismic. Within Downing Street, panic gripped the corridors of power. Advisers begged Starmer to abandon the plan, apologise, and attempt to salvage what little remained of his credibility. But it was too late. Admitting guilt meant political ruin. Pressing forward meant open rebellion. Starmer had no viable escape. Parliament had transformed into a fortress gripped by fear. Police officers stood guard at every entrance, while the sound of public fury echoed relentlessly through the streets outside. Inside the Palace of Westminster, MPs, both Labour and Conservative, spoke in hushed tones of no-confidence motions, party rebellions, and even the looming collapse of the government itself. Amidst the chaos, one figure remained strikingly composed: Nigel Farage. The man who had long fought to preserve the legacy of Brexit now stood smiling, vindicated. After years spent warning the nation of precisely such a crisis, Farage had arrived at his moment, this time with the King's blessing and the full weight of popular anger at his back. Sir Keir Starmer was cornered, exposed, weakened, and teetering on the brink. The most consequential political reckoning in a generation was about to erupt. But the conflict was far from over. Forces still loyal to Starmer were operating behind closed doors, determined to maintain their grip on power by any means necessary. In Brussels, unease had taken hold. The European elite watched anxiously, fearing the collapse of what they had considered a quiet political triumph. And somewhere within the private chambers of Buckingham Palace, King Charles observed the turmoil in silence, poised, it was said, to make a decisive intervention. As the eyes of the world turned to London, something extraordinary was brewing behind the palace's cold stone walls. Far from public view and away from the cacophony of the press, a dramatic confrontation was unfolding, one with the potential to upend the nation's political landscape. It was a royal reckoning aimed squarely at dismantling the illusions painstakingly constructed by Keir Starmer and his Labour machine. The King had summoned an emergency meeting, not a ceremonial display, but a serious constitutional intervention. This was not pageantry, this was power. At the heart of that power did not stand Sir Keir, nor his unelected allies in the European Union. It was Nigel Farage, the very man the political establishment had spent years attempting to sideline, smear, and silence. Now, Farage had returned to Buckingham Palace, not for tea and pleasantries, but for a confrontation of historic proportions. The moment he entered the private chamber where King Charles awaited, the atmosphere reportedly shifted. What had been scheduled as a quiet, formal discussion quickly escalated into a defining moment for Britain's future. According to palace sources, accounts of which have now spread across every major media outlet, the king was not merely displeased. He was livid. This was no performance, no theatrical indignation. It was the genuine, controlled fury of a monarch who had been presented with something far worse than political betrayal. What he now faced was sabotage. Sir Keir Starmer, acting in secret and without the consent of Parliament, had allegedly authorised covert negotiations with senior EU officials aimed at aligning the United Kingdom back under European regulatory control. Proposals included regulatory harmonisation, customs cooperation, and new open migration frameworks, all drafted behind closed doors. Most damning of all was a private pledge to re-enter the EU single market within 2 years. Brexit, the democratic will of 17.4 million people, was, it appeared, being quietly dismantled. And King Charles had had enough. Farage came armed with evidence, documents, encrypted messages, and testimony from whistleblowers. Among them were leaked correspondences between members of Starmer's inner circle and EU officials, in which phrases such as subtle reintegration, media obfuscation, and royal silence is critical were used like coded instructions. These were not merely political strategies, they were, in the eyes of the king, subversions of constitutional order. Deeply committed to the preservation of constitutional balance and public sovereignty, King Charles was said to be visibly shaken. Known for his diplomacy and restraint, the monarch's response, insiders claim, was unprecedented in modern times. He immediately instructed his advisers to draft a formal statement expressing profound concern over the government's deviation from its democratic mandate. But he did not stop there. The king then demanded a second audience, this time with Prime Minister Starmer himself. It was not a request. It was a royal command. By the time Starmer arrived at the palace, Downing Street had descended into crisis. News of the king's meeting with Farage had leaked, triggering panic across Whitehall. Journalists circled like vultures, while civil servants were reportedly seen frantically deleting sensitive messages. Starmer, usually composed and calculated, appeared visibly unsettled. He entered the palace clutching a carefully rehearsed set of talking points, but they proved futile. For the first time in his reign, King Charles chose not to sit and listen. He stood. In his full constitutional authority, the king delivered a stern and piercing rebuke, one now being described as historic. You do not rule the people. You serve them, and you have chosen to betray them. With those words, King Charles delivered the sharpest condemnation of a sitting prime minister in living memory. Keir Starmer attempted to defend himself, insisting that his engagement with EU officials was merely exploratory. But the king was unmoved. Exploratory negotiations, he retorted, without parliamentary oversight and without public knowledge, placed the Crown's position as a neutral guardian of democracy at risk. Starmer departed Buckingham Palace red-faced and visibly shaken. And within mere hours, the political fallout began. Conservative MPs, emboldened by both the King's rebuke and Nigel Farage's surging momentum, began drafting a formal motion to censure the Prime Minister. Meanwhile, dissent erupted within Labour's own ranks. Internal memos began leaking, revealing that many within the party's own parliamentary group were entirely unaware that such covert EU talks had even taken place. The public reaction was nothing short of explosive. Social media ignited with the trending #KingStopStarmer. Protests erupted outside Parliament. Even lifelong Remainers began to question not only the legality of Starmer's backdoor dealings with Brussels, but the ethics and sheer audacity behind them. That evening, Nigel Farage addressed the nation. Standing before a crowd of journalists, holding a thick folder of evidence, he declared with gravitas, "The era of EU betrayal is over. The people will decide again, and this time, no one will silence us." Behind him, the Union Jack fluttered defiantly, not merely as a flag, but as a symbol of rebellion. A rebellion against deceit, political elitism, and the stealthy attempt to drag Britain back under Brussels rule. The following day, Reform UK surged in the polls, overtaking Labour in key battleground constituencies. Starmer's personal approval ratings collapsed. Major donors to Labour froze contributions. And most devastating of all, the one figure Starmer had never expected to confront him, the monarch himself, had emerged as an unexpected champion of the people. King Charles, through calm but decisive action, had delivered a blow that echoed through every corridor of power in Britain. His message was unequivocal: the Crown will not permit betrayal disguised as policy. As Starmer scrambled to control the narrative, something even more dangerous was taking shape. A populist wave unseen since 2016 was gathering momentum. But this time it wasn't just older Brexiteers. It was younger voters, new voices, angry, energized, and unwilling to be manipulated by the elite once again. Farage's speeches began drawing record-breaking crowds. His live broadcasts shattered viewership records across multiple platforms. And then came an ominous development. Whispers within MI5 and the Cabinet Office began suggesting that Starmer's actions may have violated legal protocols. The Royal Council was discreetly instructed to prepare contingency measures in the event Parliament would need to be dissolved under conditions of national crisis. All of this had unfolded within just 72 hours of that fateful palace meeting. As the dust settled on one of the most explosive political showdowns in British history, the nation was left grappling with a single burning question. What happens now? Would Keir Starmer strike back, clinging to power with ruthless determination after suffering an unprecedented humiliation? Would Nigel Farage seize the moment to ignite a political revolution capable of reshaping the United Kingdom for a generation? And what of King Charles? Had the monarch, long seen as a passive observer, now stepped into the role of Brexit's final guardian? The secret corridors of power, once murky and shielded, had now been thrown wide open. For years, the public had suspected betrayal. Now they had proof. Starmer's attempt to quietly reverse Brexit and draw Britain back into the European fold had not only failed, it had been exposed for all to see. And the face of that resistance was none other than King Charles himself. In a meeting few in Westminster saw coming, the King had delivered a devastating blow to Starmer's EU ambitions. But this was no mere summit disruption, it was a political earthquake. Labour's leadership was now in free fall. Reports from within the party spoke of panic, fury, and whispers of open rebellion. Starmer, once hailed as a stabilising force, was now derided as the man who had plunged the country into a constitutional crisis with the Crown. He promised order, one senior Labour figure was overheard saying. But he's dragged us into war with the monarchy. With the party in disarray, Labour MPs were beginning to ask a painful question: could Starmer survive this? Some believed his resignation was the only path left to save the party from ruin. But while Starmer found himself mired in scandal, Nigel Farage was rising like a phoenix. He had emerged as the man who stood firm, who brought evidence to the palace, who whispered truth to power. His popularity, once diminished, had returned with overwhelming force. Polls showed a dramatic surge in support for Farage. Disillusioned Conservative and Labour voters alike were now rallying behind him as the only figure willing to defend their voice, their vote, and their country's sovereignty. As for King Charles, his secret meeting with Farage had already entered the realm of legend. The myth of the silent monarch had been shattered. This was a king who watches, who listens, and, when necessary, acts. His quiet warning to Starmer had been delivered with unmistakable finality: any betrayal of Brexit would not be tolerated. Across Britain, the public mood was boiling. From London to Leeds, Birmingham to Belfast, anger burned. "We always knew Starmer was plotting," one protester shouted outside Parliament, "but now the King himself has confirmed it." Social media was ablaze with memes, fury, and demands for immediate elections. The public wanted justice. They wanted accountability. And they wanted a leader who would honor their vote, not erase it behind closed doors. Yet this political drama is far from over. In Westminster, rumours swirl of desperate last-ditch manoeuvres from Starmer's inner circle: an emergency national address, a radical new policy announcement, anything to distract from the EU debacle. But many believe the damage is irreparable. His credibility is shattered. His authority is slipping. And the sharks in his own party now smell blood. At the same time, whispers grow louder that Nigel Farage is preparing for a dramatic political comeback, perhaps even a run for Prime Minister. Could this scandal propel him all the way to Downing Street? His supporters believe the answer is clear. "This is Farage's moment," one insider declared. "The people want him back, and this time, they'll follow him to the very top." And what of the king? Will Charles retreat once more into the quiet reserve expected of his office? Or has his stance marked the beginning of a more assertive crown, one that will not remain silent when the will of the people is at stake? Constitutional scholars are stunned. Some argue that the king has saved Brexit. Others warn that this must not become the norm. But all agree, Britain has crossed a historic threshold. Keir Starmer, broken, humiliated, clings to the last embers of power. His secret ambitions laid bare. Nigel Farage, resurgent, senses destiny pulling him back to the centre stage. And King Charles, the quiet monarch no longer, is now a pivotal force in the political life of the nation. So now, Britain must decide. Who do you trust to lead the nation forward? A discredited leader who sought to reverse Brexit in secret? A populist voice who has stood unwavering in defence of national sovereignty? Or a monarch who, in the face of betrayal, chose to speak when no one else would? The nation watches. The world waits. And the fate of Britain hangs in the balance.